Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show.
From life on a farm in rural Australia, where wide open spaces made a young woman yearn to know what was beyond her country town. She moved to the city, became a mother, and found her dream career which took her across the world. But still, something was missing. In her search for love, she traveled far, trusted deeply. She wanted so badly to find someone that she almost lost herself in the process and learned some hard lessons along the way. Fool Me Twice, a new memoir by Jules Hannaford. Available August 20th on Amazon.
Today I'm here with Vincy Chan. Hi Vincy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Vincy, tell me a bit about your background and your childhood.
So I was born and raised mostly in Hong Kong. I did live in Australia for a couple of years when I was a toddler. That was the, 97 immigration, like wave of immigration, pretty typical of people my generation. So my family moved to Melbourne, which is where I lived for about 3 years. And then they decided it would be better for me to come back to Hong Kong for school. And I spent pretty much my entire life in Hong Kong up until college when I went to Minnesota.
Oh, you went to Minnesota.
Yeah, everyone gives me like a certain reaction when I'll tell them I went to Minnesota for school. And I was there for 5 years, so 4 years for school and then another year to work. And then, visas thing.
Okay.
Those things don't
That's
quite work
so interesting.
out.
Why did you choose Minnesota?
It was the only school that accepted me.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's so funny.
You know how the U.S. college admission results are out in April and the Hong Kong ones usually aren't out until later, I think like June or July or something. So by then I was already pretty set on going to Minnesota. I really wanted to get out of Hong Kong and that was the only school that accepted me. I'd never been to the States before. I don't have family there. So it was a wild ride.
You've got a little bit of an American accent.
I didn't talk like this before I left for college and then I just slid right into that kind of Midwestern accent.
Isn't that funny? Did you have a little Australian accent after a few years in Melbourne or not?
I probably did when I first came back. And when people ask me what my native language is, and it's kind of hard to say because I did speak Cantonese with my parents and my uncle. We all lived together in Melbourne. We all spoke Cantonese, obviously. But when I went to preschool and playgroups and stuff, obviously I was speaking English. So it's hard to say, which one exactly is my native language.
Did you feel a little bit like a third culture kid? Like, did you feel like your home and your roots were in Hong Kong or Australia or America when you got there?
I would say so, yeah. And I did have a pretty tough time, I think, adjusting to coming back to Hong Kong after being in the US for 5 years. And that was a pretty significant amount of time in my life and also just pretty significant, formative years of my life.
What did you find difficult about coming back to Hong Kong from the States?
So I came out to my friends in the US after my graduation, and a lot of my friends had actually stayed around in Minneapolis or the Twin Cities after they graduated. So I had a pretty strong community around me, people that are into the arts and are all kind of up to date with any sort of leftist discourse. And I think that was very important for me at the time. It did help me learn a lot about social justice and the entire language around it.
Did you feel super accepted when you came out?
Oh yeah. People were just like, okay, you want they them pronouns? Cool. It was just done. There were no questions asked. People were just on with the program. But I knew that coming back here, gender wasn't something that was talked about a lot. race isn't something that's talked about a lot. And so I knew that coming back, even though I am coming back to some of the friends that I knew from primary school and from secondary school, I was expecting this kind of gap in knowledge and our conversation.
Well, at least you're expecting it.
Right.
So you knew that it would be there, and then you found that that was the case?
Pretty much so, I think. And I also went to an all-girls Christian school for the longest time. So my primary and secondary school, except for the last 2 years of secondary school, I was in Anglican all-girls schools.
Oh, gosh. So that would have made...
It was a life.
Yeah. Just for our listeners, when you say coming out, how do you identify?
I identify as non-binary trans, and the umbrella term transgender, I sort of loosely use the definition of people who don't identify with their assigned gender at birth. Because a lot of people, when they think gender, it's like male or female, or if you're transgender, you're like crossing to the opposite gender, right? The other side. And
non-binary, does that mean you're fluid?
People define that for themselves quite differently. So some people think that they're completely outside of the binary. Some people think they're kind of in between the two and are more fluid. And for me, I think it's more so a mix between like masculinity and femininity. And I definitely do not identify as a woman. That's like all the things that I'm certain of. I think when people ask me like, oh, what, or how do you find these labels for yourself? Or like, how are they applicable to you? The way I explain to my friends or anyone who asks is just that when you get a new dog, right? And you're trying to name it, you be throwing out like names until it responds. Yeah. You're just like, Micah, like Cookie, like Cash, like until it kind of responds. And that's how it was for me. It's like, oh, which one of these labels resonate with me
and more? So non-binary trans resonated with you. Did you try on any other labels before you got to that?
It was actually not the first label or identity that I got to. The first one was androgen, and then demi-boy, both of which are very, very kind of specific, like niche genderqueer or non-binary or fluid terms.
I know what androgynous is, but what does demi-boy mean?
Demi is just, think about like demigod, right? So it's like half god.
Oh.
Demi-boy for me is, I do identify, I guess, somewhat with, masculinity a little bit, but I'm not quite a trans man or like a boy. So demi-boy is like an in-between.
Okay, right. Yeah. From there, I
think that expanded to, non-binary and then trans and queer, because I felt like queer for the longest time wasn't really the word for me to claim or to reclaim. Even queer was a slur. For some background information for those of you who might not be familiar with it, because I did feel like I wasn't queer enough in a lot of ways. My narrative is different from a lot of people in the sense that I didn't discover my identity from a young age, because there are a lot of people who would tell me, from the age of 4, from the age of 6, they knew that they were into people of the same gender, or, they aren't a boy or girl, they're, are something else. And that isn't the case. I think mostly because I didn't have access to that information and that knowledge and that discussion when I was a teenager. And so when I did have access to it, I was already an adult and in college. And then I still took maybe like a year to think through things. So yeah, the discourse is slightly different for me in that sense.
Okay, so that makes sense. And do you wish that you had access to more information in these terms and the differences when you were younger?
Absolutely. I think me looking at the younger ones, the teenagers, when they're the ones talking about this, on Tumblr and all these places, I'm really grateful, and it gives me hope for humanity because they're able to have access to this free information and also be able to connect with individuals from around the world and outside of their cultures or their hometowns. I think that is an invaluable resource. Even for me as an adult, like being able to connect with other queer and trans people on the internet has been very helpful for me.
I think for some young people, it can really be the way for them to find their tribe,
right,
to find other people that think or feel similarly to them.
Sure.
And that can be so helpful because many young LGBTQ people can feel so isolated, can't they?
Especially when you're in an environment, for example, for me, I went to an all-girls Christian school. So that definitely wasn't in your everyday education, or I don't even remember if there was sex ed.
Yeah. Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the chances of people, being able to access this information is just non-existent pretty much when there wasn't, the internet boom of information.
Sure. Did you feel like you fitted in as a mainstream teenager when you were a teenager before you came into an understanding of these terms and this way of being?
I think that I knew that I was different, but I wasn't quite able to put a finger on it because I knew I wasn't a lesbian. There were a lot of lesbians in all girls Christian schools. As things go, people just don't talk about like the teachers and the principal just don't talk about it. But, we all know they exist. I was pretty sure that I wasn't a lesbian. I was like, I was into boys. I was into girls. So I was like, I'm not a lesbian. I didn't feel a very strong desire to be like a boy. It was more a process of elimination. And because none of the labels that I had in my hand at the time, like fit. And I was like, I guess I'm just a cis woman. And so that's how I've been operating in the world for, the next 10 years until I got to college.
That's so cool. So we've been talking about your gender identity, but what about your sexual identity? Because they're quite different, aren't they? Mm-hmm. Gender and sexuality.
I think people tend to confuse the two a lot. Even there's
a great saying, gender is who you go to bed as and sexuality is who you go to bed with.
Yeah. Okay. That's pretty accurate. I guess on technical terms, I would be pansexual.
Meaning that you're open to relationships with any gender or sexuality.
Right, because I've found in the past that I dated and had, relationships with mostly cis men in the past, but I am attracted, I think, more to masculinity than I am to men. So I guess technically the term would be pansexual, but that, again, it's one of those terms that technically fits, but also doesn't quite resonate with me. So I'm like,
these terms or these labels, first of all, you should not be labeling others, but be giving them to yourself only. And secondly, they can be fluid and they can shift and change, can't they?
For sure. And I think, things change with time because there's a whole argument about how it's a weird logic where people are like, oh, bi is when you're into man and woman, and pan is when you're also into trans. And I'm like, that's not how any of this works. Bi just means more than two, and it could be anything.
Well, that's right. Pan is anything, isn't it? It's not just the three.
Right.
Yeah, because there are other,
exactly.
There are so many different labels now, and there are more and more developing, aren't they?
I think the vocabulary around describing sexuality isn't catching up with the labels that describe gender, which is why maybe there is a slight mismatch between how people discuss the two.
Can you explain what you mean?
There are so many gender labels out there. And, when people talk about bisexuality, they're still thinking man and woman when that isn't true. And I know because of that idea of it's only, men and women that's attached to the label of bisexuality. Some people, who might be non-binary themselves might feel a little icky about using that because it has, even though they themselves think that it describes them, how other people perceive the label of bisexuality or pansexuality might affect how they relate to that label. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. And it's down to self-perception then, isn't it? And how you perceive yourself and how you perceive the labels themselves. Oh, that's really interesting. You talk about the pronouns. So do you prefer they, them?
I don't prefer they, them pronouns. I use they, them pronouns.
You use those. And so what happens if somebody uses the incorrect pronouns with you? Do you correct them? Does it upset you?
It kind of depends on what social situation that is. If it's my friends that I've come out to and, told them multiple times that I use they, them pronouns and they still, she, her, me, I'm gonna get kind of mad, or I'll message them in private and be like, hey, just a reminder, I use they, them pronouns. If it's, an interaction kind of in passing, if it's an interaction between me and a service industry worker, for example, if they call me ma'am, I'm not going to insist that they call me anything else, right? And I think also sometimes with interviewers as well, because I don't always, I guess, brief them on my gender identity when I'm there to talk about my music. So they'd be like, oh, Hong Kong's independent female singer-songwriter.
Do you correct them then? Or do you see it as an opportunity to educate or not?
Not usually, actually. Yeah.
Right.
I would like myself to be better about like standing up for myself. I'm the type of person who, like, it'll be easier for me to stand up for someone else and like to defend someone else than to defend myself. So yeah, in those situations, I usually just kind of let it go.
That makes such sense. And look, as somebody who has trans friends, people who use different pronouns, having grown up my whole life just using he or she, to adapt to using they in that context is difficult. Like I try my best, but even though I'm very aware and want to do the right thing, it's very hard sometimes and it's easy to slip. And I think that makes sense.
Yeah. But I think the important thing is like, even I would forget some of my friends' pronouns, or if they have changed pronouns recently, or because I interact with a lot of internet friends, like I do sometimes like mix up different individuals. I have terrible memory.
Yeah.
But I think like the thing is to just, quickly apologize and move on, because, it's excusable, but I think it's important to just like apologize and move on and not make it about yourself. Like, don't be the person who's like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Like, I'm the worst person. Like, for
don't make it a big deal.
Like, don't make it a big deal. And I think like most trans people are okay with
I agree.
that,
Whenever I've slipped up with anybody, they've been great about it. And then you just try and get it right the next time.
Right.
So that's all you can do really, isn't it? So how is it being a Chinese gender non-binary person in Hong Kong? How does it feel and how are you received?
It has been a little lonely at times. I'm one of the very few like gender fluid or non-conforming semi-public figures that are out there. So there's Siu Feng, the bodybuilder, and there's also Ken Chan from Bubble Air. And Bubble Air is another LGBT online media. And yeah, aside from that, I don't know of any kind of more public figures or activists that are out there with a similar label. And people do get pretty confused at times. And I think even within the LGBT and even T community, because the trans community in Hong Kong, I think by and large consists of binary trans people. And so for them, they might not understand completely what our identities are about. I know there are people out there who, what we call true scum or trans people, who focus the trans identity on dysphoria-centric discourse. So, if you don't do the surgery, you're not like committed to your gender, like that kind of conversation, which I think is extremely toxic, but I know is common in trans communities around the world.
It's hard to understand why people going through similar experiences would judge others on the choices that they make about their physical appearance.
I feel like there also is some sort of internalized transphobia that is attached to that. Like there are certain trans people who really, I think because of safety, think that they need to pass, quote unquote, to be able to survive in the world. And I do respect that because it is, it does affect people's lives. But I do think that to police other trans people's appearance or their behavior and kind of judge them based on how good they pass is a toxic thing to do for the entire community.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
I think the thing is, I'm guessing that you must be, and trans people here as well, must be much safer than some trans people, say in perhaps Middle America, where there's a lot more violence and danger. Is that a true assumption?
It's more hesitant, yes, because Hong Kong people aren't exactly the type to like be physically violent, so you won't.
Yes, there aren't a lot of safe city anyway, generally, isn't it?
Yeah, like you won't get people who get beaten up for holding hands with their partner or for, representing themselves in a certain way. But the kind of go-to, I think, violence in Hong Kong is to take pictures or videos of these people and like post them online and laugh at them. And even though that isn't an immediate physical harm, I do think it adds up and it isn't any less harmful than like physical violence.
Right. That's a really interesting point that you've made. So there's more of a subversive or undercurrent of negativity rather than it being overt.
Right.
Yeah. And that can still be just as harmful.
I think it is because people are aware that physical violence in Hong Kong often has legal repercussions, whereas, in the States or in Central America, that might not be true. People get away with killing trans people all the time. And so people are maybe a little more emboldened to do that.
But overall, it's sort of a culture that is less physically aggressive, isn't it?
For sure.
So, yeah. But it's interesting. But do you think, I wonder, is there still that negative non-acceptance of non-binary and trans people or the LGBT community underneath? Or do you think that people are more just sort of turning a blind eye and so they accept, but they don't really talk about it or question?
It sort of depends on the kind of community that you're in. So I recently did an interview with Hong Kong Free Press, and they obviously shared that article on their Facebook page. And I think they also boosted it, and like it's a sponsored post. And there were just all of these comments under that post being like, oh, you can only be male or female. Like, what are you? Like that kind of comments. It's nothing new. So I just kind of laughed it off. And I saw Tom Grundy recently and he was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry about those comments. I hid and deleted some of them because even though they had a freedom of speech kind of community guidelines, they did feel like those comments were out of line. And I'm like, I'm fine. I was pretty entertained by those comments.
Oh, good. That's a great way to think about it because it could be very damaging for you emotionally.
And I kind of expected those things, as soon as I start being more public or more vocal about my identity and who I am. So yeah, it was more amusing, I think, for me.
Oh, good on you for taking it in that spirit.
My parents actually didn't really want me to be so public about all of this. I did an interview last January, so shortly after I came out to them, which might have been a bad idea. They listened to it and they were really mad at me for like being so candid about my identity and, the things that I've gone through. And I know that one of the things that they are worried about is that I wouldn't be able to take these negative comments.
Was it hard initially?
I don't think so, because I've seen so much of that, like on the internet or on comment sections of newspapers. And I've also kind of spoken to more experienced trans activists in the scene. So Joanne and Siu Feng and all those people. And they have all, gone through the same thing. And I know that my, fellow trans activists and my friends are extremely supportive of what I do, which is what matters the most to me. And if people are committed to insulting me and misunderstanding me, then there isn't much that I could do to change their minds, I think.
No, but if you continue on the path that you are with your music and your activism, which we'll get to in a minute, and becoming more of a higher profile personality, then even if you're educating one or two people and changing some people's minds and helping also young people who are coming up in perhaps a similar situation, then you're doing a wonderful thing. Kudos to you. It's absolutely brilliant and super important, I think. So how was coming out to your parents?
They're probably not going to be listening to this, so I can talk about it.
Are they Facebook friends with you?
Yeah.
Well, they might.
I did that on New Year's Eve.
Okay.
Well, now 2 years ago in 2017, because I was like, I don't want to go into 2018, like still being in the closet. And I only told them I don't identify as a woman.
Okay.
At that point, I didn't like really, supplement them with more information.
What was their reaction?
I think they were kind of taken aback, and my mom was like really worried that I was, immediately going to do the surgery and like start doing hormones and all that stuff.
Did they have an understanding of what being, perhaps, say, transgender meant?
Well, my mom's a nurse, so she knows.
Oh, right.
She knows.
Okay, so she does. Yeah. So that's why she sort of jumped to that conclusion.
She jumped into that conclusion. And because I also said in the interview last January, like shortly after I came into them, that I actually went to a consultation with a doctor who specializes in trans healthcare. I wasn't really looking for a prescription for HRT or anything, but I was just kind of weighing my options. And, she got really mad. She's like, oh, like, don't you like start this surgery until like I'm dead or something. I'm like, okay. It was a huge thing. And then that kind of got into like them being mad, concerned that I'm being so public.
And is that just out of fear for your safety?
I think that...
Or is it a face thing?
There's also that, yeah. Because I did remember a couple years back when I wrote a blog post about my experiences with sexual assault, that was kind of the same like reaction. And they knew that, I am going to have a career in music. And they're like, oh, people are going to think that you're trying to leverage your identities or like your experiences to boost your career. I'm like, that's not what it is. Like, if that's how people perceive it, I can't stop them. That's not what it is. And both of those things are part of who I am and things that shaped me into who I am today. And they are linked to my music in one way or the other. So I will talk about it. And I'm not ashamed of it,
After coming back to Hong Kong, you started to get into the activist space?
It did take me a while. So I was still trying to get back on my feet. So I came back in the summer of 2016 and I immediately jumped into a job and didn't really have time to figure out my position in the city and, the LGBT scene. I also didn't have that many connections to the LGBT space. It was very strange because I did volunteer for 2 different LGBT organizations at the July 1st protest, like when I was in high school. And back then I was just like an ally. And I'm like, okay, that makes so much sense that I would do that as a teenager because I am part of that community. At that time, I didn't actually know a lot of people beyond people that I knew from the music studio, People Mountain, People Sea, where Anthony Wong Yumeng founded or is a part of. And he's, the kind of gay icon in Hong Kong. And he was one of the very few people that I know. And then there are some high school friends here and there who are also queer. And so I was very lost, career wise. And that was, I think, the thing that I felt the need to deal with the most at that moment. And so I didn't actually start making my way into activism until probably in the middle of 2017.
What inspired you to move into the activist space?
I think I've always felt the need to do something. I did wait until I came out to my parents, I think, to be involved in that more, or at least publicly be more involved in that. The first thing I did, I think, was a human library session at HKU. It was the Amnesty Club.
What's a human library?
So you have, or at least that specific session, we had, I think, 8 different books. So there are people and people there'd be a group of, I think, 5 people around them at a time. And they would just talk about their lives, or if people have questions they would ask. So there are Small Look, there are, a couple other queer folks, or someone who's grew up in a Catholic school, is still Catholic and is gay, how they navigate that. And I was one of them. And I think that snowballed into me doing related sharing sessions and then me getting into Amnesty International as a volunteer. I'm getting to know Bess through Human Dignity Festival. Hi, Bess.
We love Bess.
And a lot of those things.
So you're getting involved in a lot of those events. And what about the group? Is it called Resolve that you work with? What do they do?
So I joined Resolve's first fellowship program. And the way I think I got hooked up with them was because Victoria, the founder of Resolve, was part of TEDx Wan Chai. And I did do a youth and diversity, a scholar program with TEDx Wan Chai, I think in 2016. So that's where the connection was. And when Victoria started Resolve and started doing this fellowship, she did recruit from some of that TEDx Wan Chai scholar pool. And the theme for that, their first year, was racial equality, which I thought was extremely important to talk about in Hong Kong because it's not getting talked about enough. And 2 of the only Hong Kong Chinese folks that were in that cohort of 13 people. So there are people from Indonesia, the Philippines, Yemen, all over the place.
Oh, that's cool.
And I was very humbled, I think, to be in that space, even though racial equality isn't necessarily an area that I am working on or will, continue to work on. It is always crucial to, the conversations I'm having or the spaces that I'm trying to craft for queer and trans people. Again, there isn't enough, big enough conversation around race in the LGBTQ community. I was at this consultation for an anti-discrimination law based on gender and sexuality, kind of working group between different LGBT organizations in Hong Kong. And they talked about the organizations or groups that they should work out to, foreign domestic workers and sex workers organization and stuff like that. And I was like, does anyone have any information or statistic on non-Chinese and non-white queer people who also aren't foreign domestic workers, people, who are either born and raised here or are here for college or exchange or work or whatever, but aren't in that foreign domestic worker demographic? And they just kind of pulled the blank, was like, no, they don't have anything. And I'm sure they exist out there. And I don't know how I could start the conversation or start to look for these people. But I think it's so important
Why is this conversation about race in the LGBTQ community important?
I think I might get a lot of flack for saying this, but I don't care.
You go for it.
There's a huge divide in the community in terms of how it's organized based on, I think, language and socioeconomic class, because that often determines, the kind of services an organization provides or the demographic that they target to. So you have your more maybe Cantonese speaking, more quote unquote local organizations that would do counseling services and outreach and things like that. And then you have your more white expat or white adjacent middle class led activities that's around the parties and like junk boats and things. And a lot of those are catered first to cisgender gays and lesbians, usually either white or local Chinese. But I do know a lot of friends, individuals, either, friends or friends of friends who are Black or brown, or Southeast Asian, and they don't really want to be in any part of that, or they can't because of the language barrier, and they don't have anywhere to go.
So these people are slipping through the gaps, basically, and they're not being provided services and social groups and all of that, which is we all need to belong to in our community.
Exactly. And that is the kind of community that I want to find and to foster. And to build, and I have tried to host a couple of gatherings in my place, and 10 people just showed up in my apartment.
That's great. 10's great. 10's better than nothing.
That's the first time I've been in a room in Hong Kong with more non-binary or genderqueer, gender fluid folks than cis queers, which just blew my mind. And I think I do need to figure out how to do that in a more organized manner. And that's something that I would want to work on in 2019, is to maybe build a regular, physical space that could cater to that. But I do also understand that a lot of the, especially Black and brown queers, maybe who aren't out to their families, that is actually a safety concern for them. Like if they are outed or they're seen by their family or friends of their family, they would get into huge trouble. And I do want to make their safety my priority when I'm planning these things.
If I was to ask you, what advice would you have for somebody who was thinking about coming out, whether it be about gender or sexuality, what would you say? Would you say that, think about your safety first?
I think that's definitely a huge part of it. I do know that friends, regardless of race, who have run into problems with their family, getting kicked out or getting cut off from their family because of their gender or sexuality. On the flip side, I also do think the idea of coming out is unnecessary.
In the sense that you should just be who you are?
No, but I think the narrative around coming out is, wow, this is going to get me into a 2-hour rant about colonialization. But it is a very much white construct because, if you think about traditional cultures that have had fluid or diverse representations, gender and sexuality that were kind of banned.
Always a part of their culture.
Was part of their culture and were banned by white colonizers. And, suddenly...
for example, we're talking about the Fa'afafine in Samoan culture, Katois,
Two-Spirit people.
Thai
Thai all
culture.
These people, and, suddenly the West is now we're accepting of LGBTQ people, and, we need to come out.
Yeah, but the straight people don't have to come out. I don't have to go around telling everyone I'm straight all the time.
These identities have been a part of other people's cultures for centuries, and suddenly we're forced to go through the same narrative as our colonizers, and I don't think that is right. I think it also disregards the cultural context of a lot of places, because I did do an interview with a trans artist who's from Hong Kong originally, and he said the interview, something that really struck me. He said something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing, the acceptance in Chinese families don't require understanding. Sometimes your parents or your family don't necessarily know what you're going through. But I think with time, there is this kind of silent acceptance around it. And I think the idea of coming out and kind of making it a huge deal does go against the grain of our culture a little bit.
That makes such complete sense, because from my perspective, looking in, it does seem like those Chinese people that I know that do come out, it's kind of not really spoken about again, or it's just like, okay, that's fine. And we move on and everybody's still sort of accepted. So what you're saying makes sense.
Right.
I look at my culture, especially within the religious area of Western culture. Kids want to feel that they can be true to themselves and be accepted. And they feel that by coming out to their parents and then they're able to be more themselves, if that makes sense. So I think it can vary from family to family, person to person, culture to culture, can't it? I've read in some of the stuff that you've written that you have some issues in the past with your body image and with food. Tell me a little bit more about that.
So I was always, I guess, bigger compared to most girls in Hong Kong.
Yeah, you're tall, aren't you?
Yeah,
to start with.
Right. Yeah. And I'm pretty wide. My shoulders are pretty broad. I'm not a size 0 like a lot of the girls in Hong Kong that you see in the streets. And so I think growing up there was a lot of pressure, not so much, I think, from my immediate family, but from my extended family to, they always notice if you've lost weight or gained weight. And
it's quite typical in Chinese culture to comment on it, isn't it? Whereas in some other cultures, people might just keep their mouth shut.
Yeah, exactly. And Chinese culture, it's just, a way of greeting you. And I still find it so bizarre.
Funny. I was running once and I got in a lift and I said, oh, I'm so unfit. And the Chinese girl next to me said, yeah, I used to be fat once too. It was so funny. It's no, I said fit, not fat. But anyway, sorry, go on.
So I do remember very vividly that one of my aunts called me a spider.
A spider?
When I was a kid, because
meaning big body with arms?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
No.
And I just cried in my grandma's bathroom for a long time. That was very damaging, I think, to me.
And it's important to point out that one negative comment can have a huge impact, can't it? It doesn't need to be ongoing. It can just be one comment.
And yeah, it just stuck with me. And I think throughout, especially in secondary school, that was why I sort of felt like I was different from the rest of my classmates. Most of them are pretty thin, are, feminine or more stereotypically feminine and attractive. And I did feel very out of place, and I've always had. And so there were also, I think, times, especially when I was in boarding school, when, my relationship with my family wasn't so great. I started stress eating a lot. And so as a result, I gained a lot of weight. I also drank a lot in high school.
Yeah.
And so that all added up. And I think in college, I tried to regulate that a little bit. I didn't exercise a whole lot because that wasn't ever in my routine to exercise. I did play some sports in secondary school, but I was never one of those people who would go for a run 3 times a week or something. And that kind of continued on, and getting into my first relationship was also, I think, not so much a trigger, but it made me hyper aware of the body that I was in.
Which can happen for a lot of people.
Right, exactly. And because I wasn't white and I was dating a white partner at the time, I was in a very white state. So, the kind of ideal type that you would see is really the Zooey Deschanel, 500 Days of Summer, manic pixie dream girl, but hipster. Kind of that was
because you're in the States as well,
right? And
where the emphasis on that is so important.
That was the ideal, and I was pretty far from that.
Yeah.
And there was nothing really I could do about that. This is the body that I'm in, and then
there's not great representation in the media of Asian
not really
men or women.
No, and that is unfortunate, which is why I think talking to a lot of my Asian American friends helped, because, that's also what they grew up with, and that they understood, being Asian in a majority white state or country. I think that being, the realization of me being trans also add another layer to me, because I'm I don't hate my body exactly. There were, bits and parts that make me feel uncomfortable. For example, I don't like how wide my hips are. And that is genetic, that, all of the women in my mom's side of the family all have that square, just wide square hips. And again, there isn't much that I could do about it. There isn't, also, I don't have that strong a desire to undergo any surgery. I did consider binding at one point, but for me, it was too much effort. And I don't have much up there to begin with, so it was fine.
Yeah, which is lucky, but I can imagine it would be super restricting and uncomfortable as well.
And I do know that there isn't a safe way to bind, only safer ways.
But there isn't.
No, there isn't.
Right.
Yeah. So even with binders, a lot of people bind with bandages, which is a no-go. Like no one should ever do that.
Is that because you're restricting blood flow?
Blood flow, and also you're actually not letting your lungs go to its full capacity. So people would, start having troubles breathing, or, their rib cages are also taking an unnecessary pressure because,
Right.
Your bones aren't supposed to take that more
Okay,
than.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Do you feel like your body image issues were linked to your gender issues?
Looking back, I think so, for sure, which is, one of the things that finally made sense to me as to why, as a teenager or as an adolescent, I felt that I was kind of strange or, not fitting in with, didn't quite fit in. And my body was definitely one of those things. I started lifting last year.
Lifting weights?
Yeah.
Great.
Just not very regularly, but I try to go in the gym like once a week. Please.
Good for you.
That has really helped me because for the longest time I was like, I'm not athletic or I'm not fit. So I'm not going to try and attempt any sort of physical activity. But I think lifting has helped because it, one, definitely changed the way my body looks. So my shoulders are even broader than they were now, which I really wanted. And it also, I think, made me realize that there is, like, my body is capable of certain physical strengths that I wasn't aware of. And
that must be a bit exciting.
it is.
Yeah,
and
that's
like
cool.
knowing that my body could, physically progress, like I could lift heavier weights. And I was like, wow, I never knew that my body could do that.
That's so cool. And have you been able to sort of overcome those body image and food issues as you've gotten older? Or do you feel like it's something that's still there in the back of your mind or you slip in and out of?
I definitely slip in and out of it. For example, when I do have an ideal like body type that I would want to attain, but I know that to get there, it probably also means that I have to go on a diet, which I am not ready to commit to. And I think that's fine. I'm not beating myself up for it. Like if a day comes when I'm, ready to take the plunge, I will do it, but I won't force myself to do it because diets and weight loss and body image is ultimately just a capitalist scam.
It is. And it's all just on the surface.
Right.
What's more important is your soul and your heart and who you are on the inside. And this is a great message to remind our listeners out there who aren't feeling so comfortable in their own skin for whatever reason. Focus on yourself internally, and the better you feel on the inside, the greater you feel on the outside, I think.
And I think whatever you do to or for your body, make sure you're well researched, what the side effects are. This is a mild tangent, but so I was very bothered by this little frown line that I have on my brow.
Oh my God, I can't see anything for the listeners out there.
I was looking at like Botox surgeries at 2 a.m. in the morning, and it was a very weird internet rabbit hole that I went down. But I also do think that people should be able to alter their bodies in whatever ways they want to, as long as it's safe for them. Again, like you're educated on what you're getting yourself into. And I think that's fine.
I think also as long as it's not going to extremes, which then become dangerous.
Right. Yeah.
Whether psychologically or physically.
Right. So I think, as long as people are okay with that, then,
I think
to each their own.
Yeah, definitely. But there's something also to be said for self-acceptance. And this is just me just thinking off the top of my head. But I also think that sometimes we can search for a change or something different, or we want to fix ourselves externally. But once we do that, we don't necessarily feel any better on the inside.
For sure. I mean,
sometimes working from the inside and looking at our personal development and ourselves from internally, from a sort of spiritual and emotional level, that can be more effective than fixing what's external.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's sort of been my experience with people that have made changes and then it hasn't really shifted how they were feeling about themselves. Yeah, which is sad. But then, of course, there are some people who, I have a friend who had her breasts reduced and it's changed her life.
Right.
And that's great. She feels absolutely fantastic and looks amazing. So it can work both ways, can't it? Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your music career. What's going on there?
So I've had a band or project, I'd say, from last 2017. I still want to say last year, 2 years ago.
2 years.
Because I always almost performed as a solo act with a backing band. And that was how the band first came together, because I was invited to perform at Free Space Happening in West Kowloon. And
cool.
The curator was like, oh, would you want to play with some musicians that you've never played with before? I'm like, okay, I'm open to that. And he introduced me to 2 musicians, and I found, some friends of my own. That was the first iteration of the band. And it kind of snowballed from there. I've played with probably at least 10 different musicians during the time that I started this band project, but it never felt quite right because people's playing styles or their personalities, things happen. But finally, I think last year, the group really came together with new members, and they are invested in the project. And we're now just a band instead of me. And
great.
And that really kind of fulfilled my teenage dreams I've never actually played in a band until
recently.
Adults.
That's so cool.
And that is...
What's your band called?
The Prototype Lab is the name of my band. And
say it again.
The Prototype Lab. So it's like prototype, but
Prototype
K instead of a P.
Great,
and I've had so many people ask me if that's because it's dyke, and I'm like, close guess, but no.
Just because you're young.
Yeah. Because we're like mischievous kids. We like to fuck around.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And so you're starting to get a higher profile with your music, and it's sort of starting to take off. How does that feel?
We've played Fairson Stadium and played at West Kowloon, and we are hoping to play outside of Hong Kong later this year. And I think it has been a wild ride for all of us. For me, of course, because, this is the first time I think I've performed at these stages, but also for my boys, because while they are very, very accomplished session musicians, they've played at any venue you've imagined in Hong Kong, basically, because they back canto pop stars all the time. And that's their gig. But as their own band or for their own band, they've never done these things. So for them, it's also
super
new.
exciting.
It's, our music. It's our
arrangements.
Say,
is it you writing it? Who's writing the music? And
I've been writing most of the music because I've already had 10, 15 songs written before the band was formed. So I just kind of threw the songs at them. I was like, you figure out the arrangement.
Great.
I have some input. They do most of that work.
Wow, that must feel so amazing to be doing your own music.
And now we're really kind of getting into the nitty gritty of it, because in the past we've had a lot of trouble scheduling rehearsals. I was working a full-time job while, the rest of them were full-time musicians. So there's always a schedule conflict because they'd have to wait for me to get off work so we could rehearsal.
So are you still doing music activism and working?
I'm not working anymore. I got fired last year.
Okay. Is that a good thing?
I think it was, because I wanted to leave that job since day one. And having someone make that decision for me, I think really kicked me off the cliff and was like, you need to figure this shit out. But now financially hasn't been very rewarding. But I think in terms of my own growth and the growth of the band, it was really worth it.
Oh, that's great. And hopefully things will just take off more and you'll be able to be a full-time musician, as you said.
I hope so, yeah.
What are your dreams for the future?
For the year, for my life?
Whatever you like, 5 years, 1 year.
I do think that it'll be great if the band could become its own thing and we'd be able to make money off of it. I think that's very practical for myself and also for my band members, because they do know that their livelihood or their years as a session player is pretty limited. They're aware that they are easily replaceable, and that's kind of the cruel reality of the music industry. So we're really hoping that the band as a project makes it. Also trying to focus more of my time on making my art and doing illustration or commission artwork.
Oh, that's right. Of course. You're an artist as well. You're so super creative.
A lot of people just give me the face. They're like, wait, I don't know that you draw and make art.
No, I knew that. I knew that because I've just seen some of the stuff that you've done on social media.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. So it's great. Yeah, really good. So, you've got all this creativity. It's so good for the soul. It'd be so great if you could keep building that, wouldn't it? With your music and your art.
I think I do need to figure out how to allocate my time. I think even though it is important for me to do volunteer work, because a lot of that work is more immediate, it was taking up a lot of my time, even though I wasn't working a full-time job anymore. And I think I need to work my schedule a little better and prioritize a little better.
Did you find all the volunteer work super rewarding though?
I think I did learn a lot from it. from working with a bigger organization, but I also know what its limitations are. And I think I am more interested in doing like grassroots, kind of independently organized work as opposed to being attached to a bigger organization.
Have you done any writing? Because I also notice you're very good at writing. You're really, really good at expressing yourself, and the way that you write is really captivating.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I did have a couple of pieces published on this online magazine called Still Loud, which I'm running with my friends. So we do reporting on usually the local cultural scene with arts and music and photography, because we felt like a lot of the English-based media in Hong Kong that reports on the current news or on culture are written from the perspective or for a white audience. And we did feel like there is a gap to be filled for English language that is for and by more local folks.
Good for you. That's amazing. Yeah. Finally, can I ask you, what does it mean to be a role model to you? Because you are a great role model for young people in the LGBTQ and music and creative space. You're a role model. Does it mean... Am I? Yeah, you are a role model. You really are amazing. I always admire you when I see you in the activist space and just looking through your social media. I think that what you write and what you create is really profound and really inspirational. So yeah, you're a role model. So I don't know if you realize that, but you are. And I wondered if that means anything to you.
I think I'm just trying to be me and live authentically and be more candid about my experiences. And I also do think that sometimes people place a sort of unrealistic expectations on people who they regard as their role models. I was at a sharing session by the Canadian non-binary writer Ivan Coyote recently, and they were talking about how because you are of a certain minority or of a certain identity, people put you in a place of what they call an unconsensual mentorship. So they're forced kind of to be a mentor or to be a role model to someone else when they themselves are still figuring out. And I think that is a valid statement to make, because at the end of the day, we're all learning. And however experienced someone is in whatever scene they're in, they're still going to make mistakes. And being a role model isn't necessarily being perfect all the time. It is important, I think, for someone who has a public platform to acknowledge their own flaws as well, to acknowledge that they're learning, that they fucked up, and to be held accountable and to own up to their mistakes. And is a constant, I think, learning progress. The world is changing at a pace that we can't even imagine and fathom. And so I think it's so important for everyone to have that space to be able to learn and evolve.
That is so amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that wisdom with me. I love it. That's beautiful. Spot on. That's amazing. And I'm in my 50s and I'm still learning all the time. So sure. You're absolutely right. Vincy, thank you so much for meeting with me today and talking about all these issues. It's been absolutely so eye-opening and interesting and moving and inspirational. And thank you so much. You're really wonderful.
Thank you.
So confidants out there, if you know someone who'd benefit from listening to this podcast or you think they'd be interested in today's topic, please can you share it with them? Please could you also take the time to rate and review us on iTunes, which will help make Hong Kong Confidential more visible on the charts. I really, really thank you all for listening. Vincy, thank you so much for coming to join me today.
Thank you for having me.
Just remember, as Brené Brown says, owning our story and loving ourselves through the process is the bravest thing that we will ever do. See you later.
See ya.
Hi, Confidants. I want to tell you about my Patreon page. I've joined Patreon in the hope of getting sponsorship for my Hong Kong Confidential podcast. Patreon is a great way for my listeners to get on board and sponsor me with monthly payments, and that goes towards my production costs and rewards for my members. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon page, please go to patreon.com and search up Jules Hannaford or Hong Kong Confidential. I would really appreciate you visiting my page. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford, Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it? I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.